It was September 1939. The German armed forces had just invaded Poland, and one of the first orders to reach Heinrich Himmler's desk wasn't about tanks or troops. It was about a small town, a town that didn't even appear on military maps, Niepokalanów. Neutralize the media operation immediately, the Gestapo report stated. Top priority. You might be wondering, what media operation? In a town of Franciscan friars? In the middle of nowhere in Poland? The answer will change everything you think about war, about propaganda, and about the real power of strategic communication. Because what happened in Niepokalanów between 1930 and 1941 wasn't just religious resistance against Nazism, it was the first media war of modern history, and the Nazis were losing. Niepokalanów was officially a convent town. But in practice, it was something far more dangerous to the Third Reich. It was a Catholic propaganda machine, producing more content than the BBC, reaching more people than the Nazi propaganda machine, and using communication tactics that Goebbels hadn't even discovered yet. All commanded by a 5'5" Franciscan friar, Maximilian Kolbe. Let me take you inside this operation. An operation that the Nazis considered a threat to national security. Niepokalanów in 1939 didn't look like a traditional monastic town. It looked like a media enterprise. There were printing presses running 24/7, radio studios, photographic labs, design departments, distribution teams traversing all of Eastern Europe, and everything was operating with military precision. The main magazine, Rycerz Niepokalany, Night of the Immaculata, had a circulation of 1 million copies monthly. In a country of 35 million inhabitants, that meant 1 in 5 Polish families received that publication. But it wasn't just about numbers, it was about strategic penetration. Kolbe had discovered something that mass communication experts would only understand decades later. It's not enough to have an audience, no, you need an engaged audience. And he had created the first religious media engagement system in history. Each copy of the magazine came with prepaid response cards. Readers could send questions, testimonials and prayer requests. Everything was answered personally. In 1938, Niepokalanów was receiving 50,000 letters a month. 50,000. It was as if each reader was a personal correspondent of Kolbe's, an intelligence network spread across Europe. And when the Nazis started to advance, this network became much more than religious propaganda. It became information resistance. But you need to understand how Kolbe got there, because the story of Niepokalanów begins 10 years earlier, with a seemingly innocent obsession. It was 1922. Kolbe was a young friar in Rome, and he became obsessed with a question. Why were the enemies of the Catholic faith so much better at communication than the Catholics themselves? He studied Masonic pamphlets, analyzed socialist propaganda strategies, dissected the communication techniques of anti-clerical movements, and he discovered that they had a decisive advantage. They weren't afraid to use modern technology. While the church clung to pulpits and Sunday sermons, the enemies of the faith used advanced typography, impactful photographs, mass distribution, popular language. Kolbe had an epiphany. They are winning because they speak the language of the contemporary world, and we are still speaking medieval Latin. He returned to Poland with a mission, to create a Catholic media operation that would beat the enemies of the faith at their own game. He started small, a simple magazine. Rycerz Niepokalany, The Night of the Immaculata, first print run, 5,000 copies. But Kolbe had the vision of a communications entrepreneur disguised in Franciscan humility. He studied every aspect of the operation as if it were a matter of life or death, because for him, it was exactly that. He tested different types of paper, experimented with layouts, analyzed which headlines generated the most response from readers. In 3 years, the circulation jumped to 100,000 copies. In 6 years, 500,000. In 10 years, 1 million. And Kolbe didn't stop there. He expanded to radio, then to cinema. He created a printing press that printed not only his own publications, but also books, pamphlets, educational material for all of Catholic Poland. Niepokalanów became a city with 762 friars. But it functioned like a modern media corporation. There were specialized departments, marketing, market research, distribution logistics, advertiser relations, and all of this 2 decades before advertising agencies discovered these strategies. But the most impressive thing was the editorial sophistication. Kolbe didn't just publish traditional religious propaganda. He created content that competed directly with secular media, news sections, articles on science, culture, international politics. Kolbe's magazine was often more informative than Polish commercial newspapers and more reliable. Because Kolbe had understood something fundamental about mass communication, credibility is the most valuable asset of any media operation. He never lied, never exaggerated, never promised impossible miracles. In a world full of deceptive propaganda, Franciscans of Niepokalanów became synonymous with accurate information, and when the Nazis arrived, this became his greatest weapon. September 1939. German troops occupied Poland in 3 weeks. One of the first measures was to shut down all Polish newspapers and radio stations, but Kolbe had anticipated this. Months before the invasion, he had created a clandestine distribution network, secret printing presses, disguised distribution points, communication codes. While the Nazis were shutting down the official Polish media, Niepokalanów continued to function. Not openly, but even more effectively. Because now Kolbe wasn't just competing with other media outlets, he was competing with the silence imposed by the Nazis. And in a world of controlled information, even a voice whispering the truth becomes deafening. The clandestine bulletins from Niepokalanów began to circulate throughout occupied Poland, information about concentration camps, lists of arbitrary arrests, guidelines on how to help Jewish refugees, and something that made the Nazis absolutely furious: accurate analyses of the war's progress. While Nazi propaganda spoke of imminent victories, Kolbe's bulletins predicted with frightening accuracy the German military setbacks. How did he get this information? The network of 50,000 correspondents he'd built during the years of peace. Each reader of the Night of the Immaculata had become an informal intelligence agent, observing, reporting, transmitting information through channels the Nazis didn't even know existed. It was crowdsourced military intelligence, 70 years before the internet made it possible, and the Germans began to realize they were dealing with something far more sophisticated than ordinary religious resistance. It was October 1940 when a report landed on Himmler's desk that left him genuinely worried. Niepokalanov's operation is affecting the morale of German troops in Poland. The Gestapo document stated, "Soldiers are reading clandestine material that contradicts official information about the war's progress." German soldiers reading Polish Catholic propaganda and believing it more than their own Nazi propaganda. This was more than embarrassing. It was a strategic communication disaster. Himmler gave a direct order: capture Kolbe, immediately. But when the Gestapo arrived at Niepokalanów in February 1941, they discovered that Kolbe had anticipated this as well. The entire town was prepared to continue functioning without him. There were redundant systems, distributed leadership, emergency protocols. It was as if Kolbe had created a media resistance franchise. Even with him imprisoned, Niepokalanów continued publishing. The Nazis arrested Kolbe. Then they arrested his replacements. Then the replacements of the replacements. But the operation continued, because Kolbe hadn't just created a media company, he had created a movement. And movements are far harder to kill than people. That's what the Nazis discovered in the worst possible way. Even with Kolbe in Auschwitz, even with hundreds of friars imprisoned, even with the main printing press destroyed, Niepokalanów material kept appearing throughout occupied Europe, in bunkers in Warsaw, in hiding places in Krakow, in cellars in Prague, and every circulating pamphlet was proof that the Nazi propaganda machine had encountered its first real adversary. A Franciscan friar who had understood something Goebbels would take years to discover. In the war of information, decentralized distribution always wins over centralized control. But Kolbe's true genius lay in something neither the Nazis nor historians fully grasped. He wasn't just combating Nazi propaganda. He was creating a new form of spiritual resistance that functioned through media, and this would forever change the relationship between faith and mass communication. But to understand Kolbe's true genius, you need to see the specific tactics he developed, tactics that today's digital media experts would immediately recognize. Because Kolbe had unknowingly created the first religious engagement algorithms in history. Let me show you how it worked in practice. Each copy of the Night of the Immaculata wasn't just a magazine, it was a real-time feedback system. Kolbe had divided his readers into psychographic categories before the word psychographic even existed. There were different versions of the magazine for different reader profiles, one for intellectual, another for workers, a third for young people, another for rural families, but all contained discrete codes, tiny marks on the pages, almost imperceptible numbers in the corner of the images. When readers responded to the questionnaires, Kolbe knew exactly which version they had read, which sections had caught their attention, what kind of content generated more engagement. It was behavioral data analysis 70 years before Google Analytics, and he used this information to constantly refine his communication strategy. But there was something even more sophisticated. Kolbe had discovered that different regions of Poland responded better to different types of messages. In industrial cities, he focused on social justice and the dignity of labor. In rural areas, he emphasized family tradition and the protection of local culture. In universities, he discussed philosophy and science, but everything connected by the same central narrative, the defense of human dignity against totalitarian ideologies. It was audience segmentation with military precision, and when the Nazis arrived, this segmentation became much more than a marketing strategy. It became a survival strategy, because Kolbe didn't need to reinvent his communication network for resistance. He simply activated protocols that already existed. Each reader category received specific instructions through codes only they understood. Urban intellectuals received political analyses disguised as philosophical reflections. Industrial workers received practical instructions on economic sabotage, presented as advice on Christian living. Young university students received escape route maps for refugees coded into fictitious mass schedules. Rural families received instructions on hiding, persecuted people presented as biblical parables about hospitality. It was resistance through segmented communication, and it worked because the Nazis never fully deciphered the system. To them, they seemed like harmless religious publications, but to those who knew how to read, they were manuals of resistance. The Third Reich's propaganda department spent millions of marks trying to understand how Niepokalanów managed to keep its operation running. They intercepted publications, tortured prisoners for information, infiltrated agents into distribution networks. But the more they studied Kolbe's system, the more they realized they were dealing with something revolutionary. It was May 1941. Goebbels was at his desk studying confiscated copies of Niepokalanów material, and for the first time in his career, he was impressed by propaganda he hadn't created. "How do they manage to make it seem so natural?" he noted in his diary. "It doesn't look like propaganda. It looks like a conversation between friends." Goebbels had identified the secret. Kolbe didn't do propaganda in the traditional sense. He built relationships. Each reader of his publications felt they were receiving a personal letter, advice from a friend, an intimate conversation about the things that really mattered. It was relationship marketing 80 years before companies discovered the concept. And in wartime, relationship is more powerful than any weapon, because when people trust you, they don't just consume your message, they spread it. And that's precisely what happened with the Niepokalanów network. Each reader became an evangelist for the cause, not because they were instructed to do so, but because they genuinely believed in the message. It was organic, viral marketing, decades before the internet made it possible. But then came the moment that tested everything Kolbe had built, August 1941. Kolbe had been in Auschwitz for 6 months. The Nazi propaganda machine had declared victory over the subversive operation of Niepokalanów. German newspapers published articles celebrating the end of the Catholic threat. Goebbels ordered a halt to monitoring Polish underground publications. "The problem is solved," he declared. But 3 weeks later, something impossible happened. New material from Niepokalanów began appearing in German cities, not just in occupied Poland, but in Berlin, Hamburg, Munich, in perfect German. With information about Allied bombings that even German intelligence hadn't yet confirmed, Kolbe's network had gone international, and it was operating within the very heart of the Third Reich. How was this possible? The answer lay in the brilliance of the system Kolbe had created. He hadn't just built a communication network. He had built a network of human relationships, and genuine relationships transcend borders. Some of the German correspondents of Franciscans of Niepokalanów were Catholics who had moved to Germany before the war. Others were German soldiers who had encountered copies of the magazine during the occupation of Poland and were intrigued. Some were even Nazi government officials who secretly questioned the ideology they publicly espoused, all united by the same thing, the search for truth in a world of official lies. And when Kolbe was imprisoned, these relationships didn't disappear. They adapted, evolved, grew, like an organic neural network that learns and strengthens with each connection. The material appearing in German cities in August 1941 wasn't being produced in Niepokalanów. It was being produced by autonomous cells of spiritual resistance who had learned Kolbe's methods and were applying them independently. It was resistance franchising. And the Nazis finally understood they were dealing with something far bigger than they imagined. It wasn't just a Franciscan friar with a printing press. It was a new model of information warfare, a model that transformed every reader into a journalist, every believer into a propagandist, every human relationship into a channel of resistance. It was decentralized communication, viral and resistant to censorship. Exactly the model that decades later would become the basis of the internet. But in 1941 it was simply impossible to stop. Himmler ordered mass arrests. Goebbels tripled the counter-propaganda budget. The Gestapo created special departments to combat Catholic subversion. Nothing worked, because you can't arrest an idea whose time has come. And Kolbe's idea was simple. True communication always defeats false propaganda, no matter how many resources you have, no matter how much power you control. If people have access to the truth, they choose the truth. And Kolbe had created a system that made the truth viral. In August 1941, Maximilian Kolbe gave his life for a family man in Auschwitz. But his death didn't interrupt the media operation he had created. In fact, it strengthened it. Because now there was a martyr at the center of the narrative. And martyrs are the most powerful fuel for any resistance movement. Material from Niepokalanów continued circulating throughout occupied Europe until the end of the war. Newsletters, political analyses, practical guidance for refugees, and always with the same signature, in memory of Father Maximilian Kolbe, who proved that love is stronger than hate. It was emotional branding with purpose. Each publication connected the reader not only with information, but with a larger cause, with the promise that humanity could overcome barbarity through true communication. When the war ended in 1945, Allied officers found in the Gestapo archives more than 300 files dedicated exclusively to monitoring clandestine Catholic media operations. Most referred to material originating from or inspired by Niepokalanów. A final report from German intelligence dated April 1945 concluded, Kolbe's network was the most effective counter-propaganda operation we faced throughout the conflict. More effective than the BBC, more effective than the Allied leaflets dropped from planes, more effective than any other psychological warfare operation, and it had been created by a Franciscan friar with a printing press and a revolutionary understanding of the power of authentic communication. Today, when you open Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, you're using principles that Kolbe developed in the 1930s. Content segmented by audience, engagement algorithms based on emotional response, viral networks sustained by authentic relationships, influencer marketing through trusted opinion leaders, decentralized communication resistant to censorship. All of this existed in Niepokalanów decades before the tech giants discovered it. The difference is that Kolbe used these tactics not to sell products or make money, but to defend human dignity against totalitarian barbarity. And perhaps that's what the modern digital world most needs to remember, that communication technology is neutral. It can be used to manipulate or to liberate, to spread hate or to promote love, to empower tyrants or to empower resistance. The choice is ours. And Kolbe showed us that when we choose to use communication to defend truth and human dignity, no force in the world can stop us, not even the Third Reich, because in the end, the war between Franciscans and the Gestapo wasn't won by tanks or bombers. It was won by letters, by magazines, by authentic human relationships that transcended all borders. It was won by true communication, and that's a lesson that echoes to this day. Every time someone uses technology to expose the truth, defend the defenseless, or connect human hearts across the divisions created by hate, the Niepokalanów media war never really ended. It simply migrated to digital platforms. And you, at this moment, are part of that war. The question is, which side are you fighting on? And what kind of communication are you choosing to spread throughout the world? Kolbe proved that one person with a truthful message can shift the course of history. Imagine the ripple effect, the seismic shift. Think about the power of one voice, one unwavering belief, amplified through the right channels. Imagine what you can do with the tools at your disposal right now. Kolbe didn't have the internet. He didn't have social media. He didn't have the instantaneous global reach we have today. Yet, from his humble beginnings, from his seemingly simple acts of faith and resistance, he built an empire, a media empire that challenged the might of the Nazi regime. Think about that. A Franciscan friar in a small Polish monastery, Niepokalanów, a seemingly insignificant place on the map, taking on the entire Nazi propaganda machine. The Night of the Immaculata, his magazine, a seemingly small publication, became a beacon of hope, a lifeline for countless souls, spreading a message of truth, of faith, of resistance, in the face of unimaginable oppression. He understood the power of communication. He understood the language of the contemporary world. He harnessed the power of the press, a seemingly simple tool, to counteract the insidious lies of Goebbels' well-oiled machine. He crafted a message that resonated with people's hearts. He built a network of dedicated individuals committed to spreading his message of truth, and he did it all with unwavering faith, with unshakable conviction, and with an almost supernatural level of strategic brilliance. This wasn't just about publishing articles. This was a full-fledged media enterprise, a Catholic communication powerhouse. He was fighting a war of information, a war for hearts and minds, and he was winning. He was chipping away at the foundations of the Nazi regime, one article, one sermon, one act of faith at a time. And remember, this wasn't just about words on paper. This was about living his faith, about embodying the very principles he espoused. This was a man who gave his own life, sacrificed everything to save another, a testament to the profound power of faith and selflessness, a testament to the incredible capacity of the human spirit to resist tyranny, even in the face of death itself. His legacy, a living testament to the power of unwavering faith, a beacon of hope that still shines brightly today, guiding us, challenging us into imagine what we can do with the tools we have to change the world, to fight for truth, to resist oppression, to make a difference. And that is a story that deserves to be told, a story that demands our attention and demands a closer look.